Thank you very much for being with us. As I have said before, this is our first panel discussion, and I am very pleased to have with me today two leaders in the higher education space who work a great deal and think a lot about many of the issues that we're here discussing today. I'm going to ask each of them to tell you a little bit about themselves and the roles that they have. First, joining us by Zoom due to an untimely snowstorm in Indiana, we have Scott Jenkins, who is the strategy director for the Lumina Foundation. So Scott, would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work in this space?
Fantastic. So I'm the strategy director at Lumina Foundation, focused exclusively on our state policy work. I lead that effort across the country. Kim, I don't know, did you want me to talk a little bit about Lumina at this point or do that a little bit later?
Go ahead, that'd be fine. Why don't you do that now? So they
Okay, sure. Context. So Lumina is the nation's largest private foundation dedicated solely to ensuring people get an education and training after high school, the kind of learning that's essential for each of us as individuals and for the nation. Similar to North Carolina, we're guided by a ridiculous national goal that by 2025, 60% of working age people have a degree, certificate, industry certification, or other credential of value past high school. We do this because we believe these credentials are vital for success in today's world. The idea of this work, though, is not really just about jobs. It's the learning that comes through higher education enriches our lives. It opens doors to options and opportunity. It strengthens our family. It makes us more informed, which is essential to a healthy democracy. And it enhances our global economy. So reaching the 60% goal is not going to be easy. Today, just 47% of Americans, fewer than half, have some education beyond high school. And our current system, in a lot of cases, is out of step with our needs, is out of reach for many, and the system too often fails to serve people of color, working adults, and the poor. So we're working to transform higher education to be more affordable, more student-centered, accessible, and to produce fairer results, especially among African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. We put a special focus on serving low-income families, people of color, immigrants, and all who want to learn and thrive. My colleagues at Lumina and I feel strongly there's no higher mission than this, helping Americans learn and live their best lives. And as I said at the start, that mission has never been more urgent, which is why I'm really thrilled to be with you all today, even if I have to be remote and have the great benefit of looking at my computer while you all get to look at me. Our investments in North Carolina have really focused on kind of meeting the state where it is, encouraging the state to adopt a goal that sets a target for where the state needs to go with its talent development needs. We started working with North Carolina back in 2017 with UNC around serving adults. And so this has been a conversation that has been ongoing in North Carolina. And Kim, as you mentioned, we're focusing our resources and efforts for this session, but also in your work that you're leading with Eric and others around the Adult Promise Program. Our policy efforts that we've supported in North Carolina include the work that we've supported at the Hunt Institute. And we recently supported a relatively small but interesting grant with North Carolina Independent Colleges to look at reverse transfer with the community college system to ensure that students transfer prior to receiving their associate degree, when they are awarded or reach that finish line for that credential, can be credentialed through that partnership. And then finally, we have worked with the governor's office and the Department of Labor around the finish line grants and supporting kind of the Rube Goldberg-like process to comply with federal WIOA regulations to create a really novel, first in the country use of WIOA funds to support emergency aid for students who need that last little bit of resources to make sure that they're not making a determination of whether I fix my car or do I pay for my tuition. And so we're really excited. We think that North Carolina is one of the most robust post-secondary education systems in the country. Historically strong investments have made higher education more accessible than in other states, especially southern states. But performance is, as some of you all know, is middle of the road. We struggle to get out of that lane. And that's why the work of My Future NC, setting an attainment goal, looking at your public policy, looking at your institutional practice, and the work of the people in this room is so very important to the future of North Carolina. And I look forward to this conversation over the next 20 or 30, 45 minutes.
Great, thank you, Scott. Also with us today is Denise Pearson, who's the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Equity Initiatives for the Association of State Higher Education Executive Officers. So Denise, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Happy to do so. First, I'd like to thank Eric and the UNC system for having me here. This is probably one of the most important conversations that we need to be having in higher education today, because I think we'll all agree that education today more than maybe ever is the 21st century civil rights issue of our time, and we need to do something to close those equity gaps that Scott talked about, particularly along racial and ethnic lines. And I'd like to thank the young lady who brought up indigenous populations. There are minority serving institutions here in the state of North Carolina. I know there's at least one, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but there are avenues for us to be more intentional about adult populations in those I like to call them underestimated communities. We talk about underrepresented and we talk about marginalized. To a large extent, that's because they've been underestimated as a people. So, yes, I am the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Equity Initiatives at SHIO. I've been there for about 4 years. And for those of you who don't know, SHIO is the membership organization of Chief Executive Officers of governing and coordinating boards of higher education. Here in North Carolina, that would be Dr. Roper. He is our member, and I have the privilege, and it really is a privilege, to work with our members to help them achieve their goals aimed at increasing attainment, increasing access, increasing completion, and just overall student success. My portfolio is robust. I do work in the teacher preparation space, historically black colleges and universities space, minority serving institutions in general, adult education, and for this purpose, why I'm here today, for the Adult Promise Program that Lumina so generously funds. Thank you, Scott. And then I also am increasingly looking at doing work in the incarcerated population space. And I just want to say really quickly, and I may come back to it later, but when we talk about tapping into talent pools to increase attainment in our states, that's an untapped pool that you may want to consider for a couple of reasons. One, eventually 60,000 incarcerated persons are released every year. How do you want them returning to your communities? And then from a moral imperative perspective, some of them are there for unjust reasons. So to look at them as a prospective talent pool for post-secondary education, I think it's a wise thing at this time.
Great, thank you, Denise. So I'm going to pose a series of questions to both of our panelists, and we will leave time for discussion at the end. But the first question really taps into the national perspective that each of you has. What are you seeing around the country that states are doing really well in with regards to adult learners? Denise, would you start?
Absolutely. Well, I think North Carolina, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in your house, but I think you guys are a perfect example of what can be done when you start with your leadership. You know, I think you have created a sense of urgency here in North Carolina around the need to tap into and cultivate your adult student population. I think that particularly in the case of North Carolina Central University, you've done great work around leveraging prior learning assessments. I think that North Carolina having My Futures, elevated to a national level. There are great things going on across the country, not just in North Carolina. Ohio is doing some innovative stuff. Collaboration is key, and the Adult Promise work represents just that. That's what's happening, that's allowing us to be here today. Collaboration so that we can learn from one another. So with Adult Promise, there are 15 states involved, and we bring them together periodically so that they can learn from one another, go back into their communities, have discussions around those initiatives, then come back. And it's an iterative process, but after 3 years of funding from the Lumina Foundation, we're learning a lot of things. And if you go onto the SHIO website, shio.org, there is a webpage designated just for the Adult Promise work that's happening across the 15 states.
Great, thank you. Scott.
Yeah, I would pick off on what Denise said. With what we've seen over the last probably 5-6 years around this particular topic and serving this particular population is that it is an effort of will in both, and to the question, one of the questions that was asked earlier, it's an effort of will for people to think about how do we serve adults, how do we recruit adults, should we even look towards that population? Now, most of the people who work in community colleges realize that they work with working adults every single day. But in a lot of cases, from a state policymaking point of view, we still are stuck in a very much chronological K through 12, someone turns 18, how do we make policy around that? And so what we're seeing across the country that is probably much more indicative of where this work is going is that more and more when we talk to state policymakers, when we talk to institutional and system leaders, is that they actually are recognizing that this is a distinct population of students that come in with distinct needs that need to be served and are very different from how they were built. They were not built to serve these types of students. Policy was not built to support these types of students. And so what we've seen, you know, in I guess the biggest case from just that kind of messaging communication side is when we have governors and SHIOs and institutional leaders that are actually encouraging students to come back and to finish their credential, and even some really creative marketing and micro targeting of working adults that you know may fit a certain profile that they say, hey, you would be a great fit for this particular, you know, either coming back and finishing your degree because you're close, or you know, knowing that that person might not do that depending on their life circumstances. What is a quick type of training program that will give them a high quality credential with a family sustaining wage that you can directly go out and market? And by states being engaged in that process at the state level and at the institutional level, a lot of the resources that an institution might spend on enrollment creation or kind of enrollment management is lessened, so that those dollars can actually be dedicated towards serving those students.
Great, thank you so much. Why have adult learners become such a central part of the higher education conversation in recent years?
You want me to take a step?
Go ahead.
Because traditional age students, that pool is shrinking. And that's just the bottom line. And from an economic development perspective, from a global competitive perspective, if we want to be competitive, if we want to reach those attainment goals that range across the nation between 37% to 80% by the year 2030, we are just not going to get there unless we tap into every prospective pool of talent. And the adult market represents, I can't tell you the number, but there are, you know, millions of students across the country who started college, didn't complete it, but there's also a large pool of students or of adults for a variety of reasons that never started college, but there are infrastructures that are in place that can help them do that. And I just want to mention something that Sarah said early. She talked about the way the curriculum is offered. That is key. I started my career in higher education working as an associate dean for a School of Continuing Education and Professional Studies, and it was geared specifically towards adult students. And we had 5-week, I guess you can call them sessions. And so students could complete, numerous courses over the course of a year to keep them on track so we wouldn't have that opportunity lost. But short answer to your question, the traditional pool is drying up. We need to reach those attainment goals, and we're not going to do it unless we focus on adults.
Thank you. Scott? Anything to
Yeah,
add?
definitely echo everything Denise said. I would also say that we're starting to see the real push around when you have an economy that has in a lot of cases a 3% or 3.5% unemployment rate. What we hear a lot in states is that we need to get more potential employees, higher skilled employees off the bench and into the workforce. And what that requires is some form of training after high school education that leads to that type of high quality credential. The second part is that this population, by and large, depending on the state you live in, and I do state policy, so what that means is we have 50 different states, and when you look at one state, you've seen one state. If you're having a conversation in places that tend to be net importers of talent versus net exporters of talent, the conversation is very, very different. So if you're a net importer of talent, the idea of your residents of the state having access to opportunities and things like that. But if you're a net exporter of talent, investments in a student population that by and large is tied to their community and is not going to leave. So if you have a family unit, 2 kids, and you live in a rural part of North Carolina, if you can get the training that you need to get a family sustaining wage, you're not going to move off to Charlotte or Boston or Denver. And so the investment in rural communities around this particular population builds you an economy within that community. And what we've seen from that point of view as a messaging standpoint has been very helpful in people focusing on serving that population and building incentives around serving a population like that.
Excellent.
I
Denise?
just want to add, Scott mentioned the low unemployment rates that exist in many states across the country. I just want to caution folks, I probably don't need to, but I think I'm going to, disaggregate it by race and ethnicity, and those numbers will look totally different. So if you're putting on an equity lens, in search of policies and practices to meet the needs of your adult students, disaggregate that data by race and ethnicity, and it'll be a different picture.
Thank you. From each of your portfolios of adult learner-initiated projects or related projects, what have you learned? What seems to be most promising, and equally important, what doesn't work? Scott, would you start with that?
Sure, happy to. On the what we see that's really promising is the evolution of, for lack of a better term, financial aid policy within states that by and large 10 years ago was limited to just after a student has completed high school, within 18 months they're going into a post-secondary institution, they have access to that aid, that need-based or merit-based aid programs. What we've really seen is this kind of evolution of the spectrum where it goes from that level to a level of opening up a particular program for adults, opening and then opening up maybe their general aid program. So like in Washington State, when they opened up their general aid program to working age adults who could access their need-based aid program, it really changed the dynamic of who felt welcome into post-secondary ed within the state. Something they didn't realize until after they did this, and this is the things that maybe are not doing as well, but where awareness is coming because we're changing how we think about our policy development, is that just opening up aid or just creating a program for adults doesn't magically change your enrollment mix within your state or within your institution. You actually have to go out and recruit people because this is not low-hanging fruit. Your institutions are really good at recruiting low-hanging fruit. These are hard to find, hard to serve because we've already failed them once. And in a lot of cases, when you do interviews with them, that is how, they feel guilt about not being successful, but they also feel like going back to their alma mater is another sense of failure. So how we spend time convincing people to go back in as one of those ways that states do that is through their aid policy, opportunities for those types of programs, and the state policy support that can come behind that. And additionally, beyond kind of the need-based aid programs, how do you provide non-tuition supports? How do you provide the ability to say braid funding? And what I mean by that is when someone comes into the institution, how do you actually build opportunities for them if they're otherwise eligible to receive supplemental nutrition, SNAP ENT, or workforce dollars, or housing assistance, all of those types of things to make the institution a real one-stop opportunity for the individual, creates that welcoming environment where the student can do that. And that is where we've really seen state policy work together with institutional change in a lot of our states that we're working with.
And some things that don't work quite as well? Things that are not working well?
Well, what doesn't work well, and I'll try not to be harsh on this, is that the idea that you're going to open up this pipeline of potential students to your institution, and the institution feels no incentive or idea of how do we change to serve these students. To Sarah's point, how do we become student ready for this population of students? And in a lot of cases, when it's not done hand in hand, when the push for serving adults at the policy and state leadership level is not mixed with how do we change prior learning assessment, articulation, acceptance of course credits, dealing with an adult learner and the when courses are offered. Understanding all that dynamic is a lot of heavy lifting that requires a lot of self-reflection at the institutional level. And so before we go out, in a lot of cases, if all we see is the state doing the push and not an institutional response, then what we really see is we're selling the student a bill of goods. And what I like about what North Carolina is doing is in a lot of cases, this is a groundswell of support from faculty, from institutions, and from the system to say, we want to serve these students, we want to serve them better. So how do we clear our underbrush of policies and regulations that make that more difficult? But then also how do we then raise that to the state policy level and change behavior at that level? I mean, I think that's going to be slower in a place like North Carolina. But what I'm really heartened by is just the self-work that you all are doing at the institutional level to really start to address how do we serve these students better? And that's been an ongoing process, and I think it's starting to bear fruit.
Great, thank you. Denise, what seems to be promising and what doesn't work?
Cross-sector collaboration is key. Bringing key stakeholders together at the institutional level, at the state policy level, at the legislative level, so that you are all together focusing on the same problem and working together to come up with sustainable solutions. A key voice that has to be added consistently throughout the process is student voices. I think any undertaking that you engage in to better serve or create infrastructure for adult student success is I don't know, Sarah was talking about gardens. I'm going to go to the kitchen. It's half-baked if you don't include student voices. So that works really well. Data-informed decision-making. Use your IR departments and have them at the table, you know, not just bringing you data, but helping you interpret it or maybe think about it differently. So I'd say data-informed practices, and then having, you know, adequate resources, you know, and resources includes the support of your leadership. It starts from the top, going back to the kitchen. The fish rots from the head, right? But if you have strong leadership supporting this work, that's key, and that's leadership at the institutional level, at the general administration level, you know, at the community level with North Carolina Futures, at the student level. So that's what I find most effective, and prior learning assessment.
Yes, the prior learning piece, and we're going to hear a lot about that with our next panel, is key, of course. We have a few moments left for some audience questions and for some final commentary. So if you have a question, please feel free to make your way to one of the 2 microphones that we have here, and we'll be happy to address some questions.
While they're coming down,
Okay, go ahead.
I just want you, there was a question I was prepared to answer, and even though I wasn't asked, I'm going to answer it. I'm going to tell you what the question was. It was beautiful, and I was prepared for it. It says, if you were personally going back to higher education at your age, what would you need from your institution, your community, or your family or friends to make it work? And I made a list of a few. Knowledgeable faculty who are knowledgeable about the adult learner population, because they are key to successful adult education programs. Faculty who understand the principles of adult education. Sarah alluded to that briefly, knowing about the pioneering research of Malcolm Knowles. Flexible delivery methods and culturally diverse content. And then a shared goal of completion and customized support. I thought about that long and hard, so I just wanted to make sure I put that out there.
And I think that that's an interesting question that we should all ask ourselves as we think about what we're doing at our institutions. What would it take for us to go back to school at this point in our lives? Yeah. And think about the challenges that that would pose. And ask others to do the same. Ask your leadership to do the same. So I believe we have a question over here.
You actually kind of just started to touch on it. We were just having a conversation about faculty reticence and needing their buy-in, and how we sometimes see maybe a little bit of pushback in the idea of, you know, they feel like it could be a change in curriculum when really we're just talking about a change in delivery. So how would you recommend we sort of take this back and message this to faculty members who might be doubtful?
Well, how you have it structured is one thing. So, you know, I think back at my time at the University of Denver, we had a center devoted specifically to adult learners. Even though we had some tenured and tenure track faculty who taught, it was an additional load. So our classes were 5 weeks. They were in the evening, 6 to 9, and that's why we existed. It was for the adult learner. Absent of that, you know, it starts with bringing everyone to the table and finding out why they are reticent. Does it have anything to do with balancing the research, service, and teaching agenda? Finding out what are those mental or maybe even structural barriers why they don't want to engage. And oftentimes I think people are reticent because they fear what they don't know. And there are decades of research out there. Again, I mentioned Malcolm Knowles. There's some very simple principles around adult education, and if you do it right, the students can help you build the curriculum. I know when I taught in adult education units, I would tell the students, you know, you have experience in areas that I don't. We're going to build this curriculum together. We'd pull out the syllabus, I'd get their response to it. So just giving the faculty the tools that they need to examine a different paradigm and support them so that they can be successful in that venue. Undergraduate is one thing, graduate's another thing. Adult student education is another animal as well. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
Scott, do you have anything to add to that? Further questions? Here we have one coming up. Samantha from UNCG.
Hi, so we've talked a little bit about the challenges associated with recruiting students to come back to school. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts around trying to get institutional leadership buy-in to go after this population when we are challenged so often with the success of what we might think of as traditional age or native students, how to take on this challenge in addition to trying to serve the students that we already have in our pipeline.
You want to go first, Scott?
Sure. I think this is one area where you know, so I work in state policy, and in its best forms, what it can do is help people make the right decision for students by incentivizing good behavior, and rewarding institutions financially and through other ways of making the right decisions for students. And so I think one thing we have seen that is successful is where you've created a state policy environment by which serving different student populations, be them working age adults, be them students of color, be them veterans, where the institutions are incentivized through, in some cases, through their funding formula to better serve those types of students. And when those types of students do better, more resources flow in order to serve those types of students better. So you get this great policy environment, hypothetically, that would create that. One example of this is in Tennessee, with how their funding formula provides increases in their funding factor directly related to acceptance of course transfer in institutions, because it rewards that type of behavior. So it puts both institutional leadership and academic leadership at the table, having a conversation about how do we do this in a way that maintains the integrity of the institution, but also supports students and also then supports the funding of the institution. And very rarely within these conversations is a registrar involved in those kind of conversations. And what we're hearing in Tennessee is that that's absolutely someone who's at the table. And so, to Denise's earlier point, is that cross-institutional collaboration between academic leadership, institutional leadership, and kind of the nuts and bolts of the institution, I think then creates an environment by which people are incentivized institutionally to think about, okay, well, how do I have clearance now to go and support these types of students with that leadership level at the institution articulating that goal.
And I'd just like to add, I agree with everything Scott said, that cross-sector collaboration also fertilizes the ground. I ended up going back to Sarah, okay, for shared meaning. Everybody is starting from the same page. You have the same data. You have the same opportunity to question different perspectives. But that cross-sector collaboration is key, if for no other reason, or for a basic reason, there are many reasons, to make sure that everybody is starting from the same page.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much to both of our panelists, and we look forward to continuing conversations over lunch and then afterwards. Thank you.